In the first paragraph of this argument, which I put in the comments, the original copy, says that the person writing this makes the claim that God's the one doing evil in Genesis 3 when Adam and Eve eat from the tree that God commands them not to eat from, and that was only a small act of disobedience, so they shouldn't have been punished as harshly. And disobedience is actually a positive trait or virtue, because people or heroes in the past defied and disobeyed totalitarian leaders, and that if it wasn't for these acts of disobedience, we would be nothing. So first I'll show all the things that I agree with this argument, and now I'll point out the disagreements. So now that I've pointed out all the arguments and points I agree with this, let's examine the disagreements. For the first point, he argues that it was a small sin. But how do you define morality and sin? You can't just say, I define morality, because then any morality could be anything, therefore you couldn't argue it. But the Bible, what I use for defining morality, defines sin as rebelling against God's law. Well, what are Adam and Eve doing in Genesis 3? They're rebelling against God's law, so they're sinning. 1 John 3:4 says, everyone who sins is breaking God's law. In fact, sin is breaking God's law, end quote. So for them to argue that disobedience to God is actually heroic or just doesn't make any sense in the biblical terms, because disobeying God is sin. And furthermore, they're comparing a perfect God's leadership to a totalitarian dictator. That's a little bit of a false equivalence fallacy. And how did they define morality? By human heroes? Not even biblical heroes should define morality. Take, for instance, David, a biblical hero. He won many wars for God. He followed God, but he messed up. He committed adultery with Bathsheba to cover up his sins, and he sins more by having her husband killed in war. Not too moral of a hero, and that's why we're not supposed to follow people. We're supposed to follow God, and God defines morality. And to take one of these sinful heroes and make them your example of morality is absurd. There is one hero, however, who did provide the perfect example of morality. Perfectly good, who knew that everyone was doomed to eternity separated from him. And to save us, he took our punishment and bore our penalty. He was nailed brutally to a cross, the cross where we deserve to be. And death and sin could not hold him. So 3 days later he rose again, so that anyone who believes and follows him may have eternal life.